Trump had already single-handedly reignited his Arlington National Cemetery scandal yesterday by implying that the VA and the Department of Defense are lying about it entirely when Fox News doubled down on the lie, and Trump had suddenly basically put the entirety of the military establishment in the same position Senator Joe McCarthy tried to put it in 1954. The mistake, deciding you and your lies are more important and will be more successful than the military's truth. That destroyed Joe McCarthy. It could conceivably destroy Donald Trump. Quote, there was no conflict or fighting at Arlington National Cemetery last week. It was a made-up story by Comrade Kamala and her misinformation squad. She made it all up to make up for the fact that she and Joe, etc., etc. Before that, the Trump position had been that there was an incident, that a woman staffer having, per spokesclown Stephen Chung, a, quote, mental health episode had caused the incident. A staffer who, per Chris LaCivita, the one who does not know its hallowed ground, is a, quote, disgrace and does not deserve to represent the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. Chung had also insisted 9 days ago that exculpatory video existed and the Trump campaign had it and was prepared to release it if the, quote, defamatory claims continued. There has been no release of video. There has been no evidence provided that any video exists, except, of course, the video that Trump's campaign illegally recorded at the grave sites of other dead American war heroes whose families did not give permission for such filming, and which in any case cannot legally be used for political purposes, which is exactly what Trump's gang promptly did. But this, from Trump, this is an escalation, regardless of how crazy he is or how crazy what he wrote sounds. Trump has now painted himself into a corner. He has entirely changed his version of this story. This is no longer a staffer overreacting or worse. This is a story, quote, made up by Kamala Harris. That in turn implies that there is not any Trump videotape exonerating the Trump team of what the Army has previously stated was an incident in which at least one Trumpist at least put hands on the woman employee. This was already enough to put the two secretaries of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and of Veterans Affairs, Dennis McDonough, in a position of no longer just having to defend a cemetery staffer who is justifiably terrified of retribution from Trump's psychotic cult and from Trump himself. Trump has now just said the whole thing was made up by the vice president. That implies that all statements from the military are fictional, that the Army's public support for the employee is part of some kind of smear campaign against Trump. In sum, that the staff at Arlington National Cemetery, that the executives at the VA, that the Pentagon, that the military itself, that all of them are lying. And then the Fox nickel-dime bullies chimed in and somehow made this worse for Trump. In terms of the incident, said Jesse Waters, the one who stalked a Think Progress writer on orders from Bill O'Reilly years ago, there was no incident. From what I understand, a woman had a mental issue, and I don't know if it was TDS or something else, but it was handled. If there was an altercation, said Janine Pirro, the one who was charged with driving 119 miles an hour in a 65-mile-an-hour zone, get yourself an affidavit that's sworn to, file yourself some criminal charges, or shut the F up, unquote. Advice Ms. Pirro has never taken herself. At this point, the Pentagon does not have much choice. Trump has called everybody from the unnamed staffer at Arlington through the Pentagon to the vice president, not just liars, but fabricators, part of a conspiracy against him. I am not usually big on the honor of the military, but I do come from a line of veterans, literally stretching back to Ferdinand Louis Jacob, my second great-grand uncle on my mother's side. He fought in the Civil War. He survived 3 months as a POW at the Confederate death camp at Andersonville. And all those related veterans I knew, including my father, and for all I know, great-grand-uncle Ferdinand, were proud of their work in the military, but they all warned about the dangers of worshiping the military for its own sake. But Trump's pattern, sequence, series, compulsion to smear those who sacrificed anything for this country, whether it was voluntarily or because they were drafted, whether it was just a few months of annoyance at Fort Dix, or it was managing to not starve to death at Andersonville because he found a hidden onion bush like Ferdinand Jacob, or it was like getting shot down over Hanoi like John McCain, or it was dying like those Trump literally walked all over to take a campaign photo. There is a line here. Even for the most cynical among us, there is a line here. And Trump has once again crossed it. There are means to protect the actual reputation of the military while also protecting the staffer, the woman who was verbally and physically abused in some way in real time and was then immediately slandered in acts of unvarnished misogyny by Stephen Chung and Chris LaCivita. And if the orders have to come from the commander-in-chief, President Biden should give them. There is a woman here, the latest among thousands, physically and or emotionally abused by Trump and his thugs. There is an American institution here, however flawed it has been at many times, which Trump has suddenly decided in yet another episode of delusional paranoia he must break. They all deserve to be defended. The fundamental decency of this country demands they be defended. There needs to be a Senate hearing on this event. Start it immediately. If the VA or the Department of Defense have to investigate and report, do it and do it now. If there is security video at Arlington, and one cannot imagine there is not, it must be released with the woman's image blurred and her identity otherwise protected. And the idea that just leaving this alone now will protect her is naive at best. These are Trumpists. They have the selfishness and amorality and animal cunning of stalkers. They will identify her sooner or later, or maybe worse still, they will identify the wrong woman sooner or later. And the most certain and most complete way of defending this employee and the VA and the Department of Defense and the nation is to once again prove that Donald Trump's entire patriotism act is a bitterly cynical and corrupt confidence trick, that the last man in this country who should be able to pretend to be the victim of some sort of complex scheme concocted by the vice president and the army is this creature Trump, who evaded military service with bone spurs that go on and off like a bad neon sign. The incident alone was enough to make a 17-year service veteran, a first lieutenant, erupt in righteous indignation yesterday. The Trump campaign event at Arlington was, the first lieutenant told CNN, a, quote, violation. It just blows me away. These men and women that are laying in the ground there have no choice, unquote, whether or not to be extras in yet another Trump sales video. The first lieutenant's name is Jimmy McCain. He is the son of the late Senator John McCain. He says he has changed voter registrations and is now, because of Trump, a Democrat who will vote for Kamala Harris. It was 70 years ago this past March, the last time a cheap, mentally ill politician tried to take on the American military, even though it was one of those rare occasions when the military was entirely right and the civilian was entirely wrong. On that occasion, it was Senator Joseph McCarthy at the height of his perversion of the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, the pinnacle of that edition of the Red Scare, and McCarthy began to accuse the military of subversion by communists. He started it in 1953. And as 1954 loomed, he had his chief counsel imply that the Army had drafted a McCarthy staffer, a man named G. David Schein, to try to hamstring McCarthy's investigation of the Army. The Secretary of the Army in turn said that McCarthy and his lawyer had pressured the Army to give this Schein guy preferential treatment, even a commission, even, it was rumored, a deal by which McCarthy would slow walk its investigation of the Army if the Army gave Schein better treatment. McCarthy then insisted the Army had made that accusation in bad faith and as retaliation for his investigations. The next thing you knew, the Senate called hearings. The Army-McCarthy hearings began on March 16, 1954. Soon they were being televised, gavel to gavel, all day on multiple television networks when there were only 4 of them. By June 9th, the Army's civilian lawyer, Joe Welch, was famously asking McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" By December 2nd, the Senate had censured McCarthy. By 1957, hopelessly broken by alcoholism and almost forgotten, Joe McCarthy was dead. I go into such detail not to suggest that is what will or should happen to Trump just because of this, but because you would think Trump would remember that it was what happened to Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy's chief counsel, the man at the center of all this, was, after all, the future Trump mentor Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, venomous as he was, would have probably told Trump to make sure that there weren't security cameras at Arlington before implying that the entirety of the Army was lying about this. There probably was some point in Trump's life when he would have listened to Roy Cohn telling him that. However, I believe that today we are many decades removed from that moment. The other investigation I urged here yesterday has begun, albeit in the wrong chamber, with little hope of a meaningful outcome unless the Democrats take the House. But at least Congressman Jamie Raskin and Robert Garcia, representing the minority on the House Oversight Committee and the National Security Subcommittee, have launched an investigation into the report by the Washington Post that Trump may have been bribed with $10 million by the Egyptian President el-Sisi in the waning weeks of the 2016 campaign, and that his own Department of Justice covered it up. The Democrats could very well take the House, in which case this will not be some sort of Jamie Comer stage show with Marjorie Barney Rubble Green holding up enlarged porn. Right now it is a stake hammered into the ground, the way an announcement from the Defense Department or a Senate committee about releasing Arlington security video would be a stake hammered into the ground. But as an aside, it is fascinating to contemplate just how much will rain down on Trump's head legally if he loses on November 5th. Add Egypt to that list, and now we must make sure somebody adds the Trump Arlington Cemetery Scandals to that list. And as to the event central to the trials of Donald Trump, polling news continues consistent and strong but hardly conclusive. USA Today and Suffolk University. Harris now leads Trump 48-43. That is within their margin of error. 1 in 10 voters say the televised debate next Tuesday might lead them to change their mind, or they are undecided. The boost for Democrats, USA Today concludes, has extended down the ballot. In June, registered voters said they supported their local Republican congressional candidate over the Democrat by 47-45. Now, it's the local Democrat over the Republican by 48-43, a swing of 7 points for the House candidates. In the vote poll in June by USA Today and Suffolk, Trump supporters were twice as likely as Joe Biden supporters to report being very excited about voting for their candidate. The enthusiasm score was Trump 59, Biden 30. Now, while Trump's enthusiasm remains at 60%, in the new poll of likely voters, enthusiasm among Harris supporters is at 68%. Biden was at 30%. Some other interior numbers of importance. Voters favor Trump on the economy by 6. It was 14. They favor him on immigration by 3. It was 13. On national security and China, they favor him by 4. That was 10. There is something of a scare from Michigan polling yesterday, but it is safe to take it with a grain of salt. The Detroit News and Channel 4 there did a Michigan poll with Glengarriff Group. It's Trump 44.7, Harris 43.5, or as the newspaper headlined it, presidential race, a toss-up in Michigan. The same pollster had found Harris ahead by 0.3 point in July, and that, too, needed a grain of salt because at the 538 rankings of pollsters, Glengarriff Group, which did the Michigan poll, got a poll score of minus 0.2. It ranks 175th out of your top 50 pollsters, and on a scale of 1 to 3 stars, it gets 1.5. There is also the other kind of political number, and I'll just read this from Politico. The leader of House Republicans' biggest super PAC told donors last month he needed $35 million more to compete with Democrats in the fall. Senate GOP campaign chair Steve Daines used his primetime speaking slot at the Republican convention to lament that massive spending from Democrats was keeping him awake at night. And his House GOP counterpart warned that their party's challengers trailed Democratic incumbents by a collective $37 million at the end of June. The money quote? Panic is starting to set in. Oh, no, not panic. Not panicked by the Republicans. Oh, damn. Well, at least, for the sake of fairness, the Republicans and their propaganda channels have the game plan to win back the White House. The searing attacks on Kamala Harris's record and personal integrity that come day after day and week after week, that absolutely under no circumstances make anybody in authority erupt in rage at them, nor anybody at home burst out into uncontrollable laughter. Fox White House, quote, correspondent, unquote, Peter Doocy to Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Since when does the Vice President have what sounds like a Southern accent?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well,
I mean, this is...
She was talking about unions in Detroit using one tone of voice.
Is this something that
same
you think...
line.
Okay, Peter.
That she used the same line in Pittsburgh, and it sounded like she at least had some kind of a Southern drawl.
I mean, do you hear the question that you're... I mean, do you think Americans seriously think that this is an important question?
Yeah, she used a Southern accent in Detroit, you say. Detroit, which I believe was the capital of the Confederacy, if my second great grand uncle remembers correct. Peter Doocy, son of Fox's Steve Doocy. Peter Doocy, whose pre-Fox resume consisted of work at Palestra.net and, of course, other places. Well, no other places, just Palestra.net. Then right to Take Your Son to Work Day at Fox. What we need is Peter Doocy at the White House podium being asked why Fox has a Nepo baby covering the White House. To which his best answer would be, Dad! I used the phrase money quote earlier. I will use it again here in an entirely different context. There is this, for those of you so into campaigns and elections, at politics might as well be porn. Mark Robinson is the sometimes laugh-out-loud stupid, sometimes dangerous Republican nominee for governor of North Carolina, the some folks need killin' guy, a born-again who is already lieutenant governor there. The North Carolina news outlet The Assembly reports, according to Louis Money, who worked in several of Greensboro's windowless 24-hour video pornography stores, Mark Robinson was a frequent customer in the 1990s and early 2000s. As an aside, I'll note, it's a free country. Resuming the quote, Money, 52, told the Assembly that Robinson came in as often as 5 nights a week to watch porn videos in a private booth. Never shake this man's hand. 5 other men who said they were former employees or customers during this period also told the Assembly that Robinson visited 2 of these stores, Gents Video and News, and I-40 video and news. In addition, Money said Robinson purchased hundreds of bootleg porn videos that Money sold on the side. Quote, he was good for at least one a week, Money said. The last one he described as a compilation of super hardcore films he acquired in New York City that were too risque to be sold in North Carolina. Too risque to be sold in North Carolina, you say? But sold in New York and then brought back to North Carolina? Sold in New York? Well, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to guess that he means the ones that were shot at Trump Tower. Just a guess. A spokesman for Lieutenant Governor Robinson called that whole thing fiction, and the reporters, quote, degenerates. Oh, degenerate reporters gone wild. Save a copy for Mark Robinson. And there is a punchline upon punchline. Mr. Money, that's Mr. Money, presumably of Gents Video and News, says that the final super hardcore compilation video, the sizzle reel, the New York stuff, he charged Robinson $25 for it, and Robinson still hasn't paid him. Also of interest here, Tammy Laren steps into the worst person's spotlight. They can't figure out why the Vice President of the United States can't take a phone call while on wireless earbuds like everybody else. And Elon Musk believes the world should be run only by high-status males. Now, why would he want to exclude himself like that? That's next. This is Countdown.
George Carlin, pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. This is the best news show ever. I told that to one of your producers, and I want you to know that. I've seen them all, and it's just, especially the first 35 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
It's just unparalleled.
I got bad news. Between you and I, we got 6 minutes to completely screw that into the ground.
Okay,
right?
that's good.
On this edition of Countdown, football starts tomorrow night. To continue a week-long celebration of the beginning of yet another season in the National Football League, permit me, the former host of Football Night in America, to tell you the saga of the year the season started and then suddenly stopped because the Players Union walked out on strike. And I went with them, and I got to go get drunk with all of them. The impossible sagas of me, the rookie reporter, and the 1982 NFL strike, next in Things I Promised Not to Tell. First, there are still more new idiots to talk about, the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. He could go all the way. The bronze, he could go all the way. We'd be satisfied if he just went away. Elon Musk. You remember Elon Musk? This one would be higher, but for two reasons. First of all, it's from Sunday, so it's getting a little stale. I mean, it stunk to begin with. It's not stinking that much more than it was Sunday. It's just old. The second reason I'll note in a moment. You'll notice that Elon Musk turns out not to have been very bright, just very lucky with other people's ideas. He's made billions of dollars, and now he's burning through billions of dollars at a rate that will leave him on a fixed income by sometime in the year 2031. If there is a year 2031, and if Elon has his way, there probably won't be a year 2031. His rockets don't work, his cars don't work, and his website doesn't work. But that's not stopping him, because all he has is people around him telling him everything's better than ever. And he's now reduced to the level of a mediocre QAnon person online. Now we know why he bought Twitter, to turn it into a right-wing website that would argue that rich right-wingers should be allowed to rule the world, and if we don't let them, they'll simply buy the world from us and rule it anyway. Somebody with the account titled Autism Capital put this out and added, also known as the Reich effect. And Elon retweeted it with the number 3 of his 30 observations on all tweets. That's interesting, or deserves thought, or very interesting. This is interesting observation, Elon says. People who can't defend themselves physically, women and low-T men, parse information through a consensus filter as a safety mechanism, writes Autism Capital. They literally do not ask, is this true? They ask, will others be okay with me thinking this is true? Well, this is provably false. The number of people who actually do this, I don't know, but they're all Trump supporters. This makes them very malleable to brute force manufactured consensus. If every screen they look at says the same thing, they will adopt that position because their brain interprets it as everyone in the tribe believing it. Well, that's the premise of Elon Musk's website. Anyway, the conclusion here is only high T alpha males and A neurotypical people, hey autists, are actually free to parse new information with an objective, is this true filter. That's also provably untrue. This is why a republic, here's the punchline, this is why a republic of high status males is best for decision making. Democratic, but a democracy only for those who are free to think. Well, first of all, what a novel idea, Elon. A republic of high-status males only. Because we've never had any government in this world, no country in the history of civilization has been run only by men who thought they were high status, usually erroneously. We've never had that before, even though there's never been, up to this point, a woman president of the United States, or, let's see, there's only been, 3 women prime ministers in the United Kingdom, and one of them didn't last as long as a head of lettuce, and you know the whole thing. Yeah, I'm sure. What a novel idea. Let's have some high-status males who are wrong about that, too, being the ones making all the decisions. So not only is it stupid, not only does it go right into Elon Musk's ego, but the second issue is this guy, Autism Capital, is on 4chan, which is for people who are not smart enough nor discerning enough to be in QAnon. They wanted democracy to exist solely of high-status males because that would be best. Well, what on earth would that have to do with Elon Musk? High-status male? Does Elon Musk really consider himself a high-status male? With that haircut? Anyway, the runner-up, the silver, ActiVote, an alleged pollster. We can thank for this a former pollster named Adam Carlson, who says he has signed up for ActiVote via their app. He said his name was Gregor Mendel and that he lives in Arizona, and he put as his home address City Hall, Phoenix, Arizona. There was zero verification of any of these things, he adds. My candidate preferences will be reflected in their next Arizona poll. He says he then deleted all of the information. He was just doing this to prove a point. The Activision folks, or ActiVote folks, not Activision, that was a game console if I remember correctly. The ActiVote folks say that this is all part of the process and it allows the full range of voters, the real ones and the fake ones, to express their opinions. And I want to just thank Adam Carlson for revealing that we don't need to take seriously ActiVote any further. Congratulations also, Mr. Carlson, on supporting Ruben Gallego for senator. I guess we should call you Abbott Mendel, not Adam Carlson. And congratulations, Abbott Mendel, on your work with peas and heredity. Sadly, some of those recessive genes that you discovered all those years ago apparently gathered together to form ActiVote. But our winner, right-wing troll Tomi Lahren. You know her, blonde, number 389 on the right. I really can't get over Kamala using old-school Apple headphones to avoid talking to the press. Tommy's life is in one long assumption. She's got a photo off C-SPAN in which the Vice President of the United States is being escorted either to the helicopter or off the helicopter while wearing, attached to a phone, a pair of Apple iPad phones or iPod phones or just Apple iPhones, but with the wire, not the buds. We've seen a lot of shenanigans from this lady, Tommy writes, but this might be the most pathetic to date. feels like her campaign specifically had her use those old-school headphones instead to make the point she was on the phone, and that's why she couldn't interact. Well, she did interact, number one. Number two, Tommy, again, is assuming several things that she's already stating as facts because she's assuming them, which sends me back to that first group, that guy who said that we should be run by a bunch of high-functioning something or another's. In any event, the photo just has Kamala Harris waving to the press and not stopping for questions. You know, the headphones, Timmy, are there because the Vice President of the United States is on a phone call, which is presumably not about dry cleaning. It's presumably about something, important, and that's a secure mobile device that the phones are attached to. And if you were to wear earbuds or other wireless connections, Tammy, the conversation could be intercepted electronically. And you'd know that, Tony, if you'd ever had an important phone conversation or any kind of important conversation in the entirety of your worthless, useless life. Tommy Lahren, just not bright. Today's worst person in the world. I thought I could see it through the swinging kitchen door of the Il Vagabondo restaurant on East 62nd Street in New York. What I thought I saw seemed to be an extraordinarily large man standing over one of the large kitchen sinks, holding one of the kitchen's big flexible rubber water hoses, and drinking from it. It was an unusual enough sight, but there was also a complication. That extraordinarily large man was one of my dinner guests, and his name was Gene Upshaw, the just retired offensive guard of the Oakland Raiders and president of the National Football League Players Association. Gene was 6'5", 260 pounds, but he seemed much larger than that. If he wanted to drink out of one of the giant kitchen hoses, I wasn't going to stop him, nor was anybody in the kitchen, nor was everybody combined on East 62nd Street, nor was anybody in the city on that Saturday night so long ago. 2 nights later, Gene and the executive director of the National Football League Players Association, Ed Garvey, and its outside counsel, Chip Yablonsky, would officially take their union out on the last successful strike in pro football and introduce to the entire world of sports what was then, and I literally mean then, that evening on CNN, just before our trip to the restaurant whose kitchen hose Gene was now drinking out of, would then introduce to sports what was then described by a nationally prominent sports writer live on TV as, quote, communism. Executive Director Garvey had proposed a deal with the owners that would be based on giving the players a percentage of gross income, 55 cents out of every dollar taken in by football. It would be given to the players, and within a structure allowing for individual players to negotiate individual contracts, the players would basically figure out how the rest of their 55% would be divvied up among them. The owners would keep 45% and divvy it up any way they wanted to. Today, this is the basis of the contract offers made by the sports owners to the players' union. But in 1982, on September 18th, 1982, live on CNN with me as host, this was called communism by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution sports writer Furman Bisher, whom I had been reading since I was a kid. Bisher was one of the guests in a special show which I anchored from New York, with Garvey and Upshaw in the studio with me. Bisher went further. He called Garvey a communist, and I apologized, and Garvey said, "I've been called worse today." This was why we were all out to dinner at Il Vagabondo, an Italian restaurant so Italian that there was a bocce ball court in the middle of the main dining room. Our CNN executive sports producer, Rick Davis, had said that if I could talk Garvey and Upshaw into going on our show on a Saturday, I could take them out to dinner. He added, "No, and I mean at a nice restaurant." Garvey had already turned into a great source and a great friend with whom I would stay in touch for 35 years. The day before, he had matter-of-factly told me, and only me, a sports reporter from an obscure TV cable network called CNN, that when the union's executive council met the following Monday, that there was only one option on its table: a strike. This was a huge scoop. Later, Garvey would tell me that the union had made a deal with Ted Turner, who happened to own my network. If the union could get the National Labor Relations Board to rule that the owners had forced that strike, the union would be entitled to break all its contracts with the National Football League and sign a new deal where the players and Ted Turner would co-own all of professional football in this country. Would you like to do play-by-play? Ed said. It didn't happen, obviously, but that also was a great scoop, and they tried it out in miniature. They played 2 glorified pickup games, one at the LA Coliseum, one at RFK Stadium in Washington, under the greatest sports league acronym of all time, All-Star Season. Yep, ASS. It was also Ed Garvey a month later in the middle of a press blackout imposed by the National Labor Relations Board mediator who sneaked into my hotel room outside of Baltimore and gave me an exclusive interview anyway. Garvey arrived just after a housekeeper had knocked on my room door and without waiting for an answer had entered. That housekeeper saw the following scene. Me in a suit sitting on a chair. The CNN cameraman sitting at a table with his big, bulky camera and tripod, and the videotape deck operator, who happened to be a woman, lounging atop my still unmade bed, watching her favorite soap opera on TV. The housekeeper took one look, literally shouted, "Lordy," and she backed out of the room, nearly knocking down Ed Garvey in the process. Later in the strike, the mediator quit the talks one night. Then the owner's guy also walked out, leaving Ed Garvey and the players by themselves. I sat Garvey down for another interview, and I asked him, will the absence of the media and the league's negotiator make any tangible difference in the negotiations? And Garvey laughed without interruption for 90 seconds. Gene Upshaw, who in telling this story I have left in the kitchen drinking from the hose all this time, and it's actually almost how long he did drink from the hose that night. He was just as good a friend and a source, whip smart and often too honest for his own good. 5 years later, when he had succeeded Garvey as executive director and the players again went on strike against the NFL, I had a tip that the strike was collapsing because the owners had brought in scab players and they kept playing games anyway. I called a lawyer I knew in the union, and he was hemming and hawing when I heard him say, "Wait, Gene wants to talk to you." All Gene Upshaw did was, off the record, confirm that the strike had indeed collapsed and he expected lots of union players to cross the picket lines the next morning. I said, "I can use this?" He said, "You've always been honest with me. The least I can do is be honest with you. Matter of fact, you can say high-placed union sources told you." Ah, screw it. You can quote me, Keith. But wait till after midnight my time. I got to call these guys. Unfortunately, this meant that when I interviewed the now Los Angeles Raiders team union rep live on TV a few hours later in Los Angeles, and I asked him if the strike was in its final hours, he said no. And I said, "Yeah, it kind of is." And it was the head of his union who had told me so. Anyway, that night at Il Vagabondo, Upshaw and Garvey and Chip Yablonsky told me 20 stories I would have killed to use that night, but they were all off the record. I think I can mention a couple of them now since it's, checks watch, 40 years later. At one bargaining session, one of the league's lawyers, Vince Lombardi Jr., was arguing with one of the player bargainers, linebacker Stan White of the Detroit Lions, who was also a lawyer. The players were asking for something that is still a bone of contention between the two sides: full access to their own team medical personal records. Vince Lombardi Jr. looked at White and said, "What are you going to do with them even if we gave them to you? You guys are too stupid to understand them." At that point, White, who might have been a lawyer but was also still a linebacker, leaped over the bargaining table and tried to get his hands around Lombardi's throat. There were also a few hours of shared insults about top NFL announcers and executives and players, and a good deal of wine at this dinner. And periodically, when there were no more breadsticks at the table or antipasto at the table or water at the table, Gene Upshaw would simply get up and go into the kitchen and get it himself. When the evening was over, my diary notes that we had spent, for 4 men, 4 large men, of whom I was the smallest, with wine, with a generous tip at a top New York restaurant, on CNN's dime, the staggering figure of $155. Still translates only to about $470 today. It was a lot of money then. CNN was paying me $26,000 a year. Anyway, we all walked out into a lovely New York September Saturday night. Garvey, Upshaw, and Yablonsky were all staying in a hotel not from where we had eaten and not far from where I lived, so I walked them back. And Upshaw had one more immortal memory left to create. It happened that he was on the cover of that week's edition of Newsweek magazine, and as we passed one of the old ubiquitous Manhattan newsstands, which were just tiny shacks on nearly every corner of the city, Gene leaned down and into the little window through which the newsstand operator peered out, and he said politely but firmly, "Have you got a copy of the one with me on the cover?" Face it, nowhere else in the news world or in the sports world are you going to get that as your 2024 NFL season preview. I've done all the damage I can do here for one day. Thank you for listening. Please share this podcast with somebody who doesn't already. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music, including this here, what you're hearing behind me now. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, and drums, although they did not actually write this. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music, when we have a sports segment, is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by a group called No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my late friend George Carlin. Everything else was pretty much my fault. Let's count down for this, the 63rd day until the 2024 presidential election. And yes, I'm saying 63rd. Others will say 62nd today. I am including Election Day itself because that is the day when a terrifyingly large number of people actually decide who to vote for. On Election Day, on their way to the polls, or sometimes while they're standing there. In any event, the 63rd day until the election. Also, the 1,331st day since convicted felon Donald J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the September 18th sentencing hearing if it happens. Use the mental health system. Use presidential immunity. The Supreme Theocratic Court has given it to you, President Biden. I say, if it's official, it's legal. So crazy, go nuts. Have fun. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news requires. Until the next one, whenever that is, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.